Thanks.
There you go, Yosh. Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, just to recap, right? From RFC 10, we had talked about these two different approaches. One was the idea of having a value with an overridable true-false flag in the supply chain. The other approach was having a default value semantic that got applied to all the different places where params are used, where default means that you can override something, value means that you can't override it anymore. So what we did is we originally implemented it with overridable flag as per the initial recommendation, but then we found prior art in the pod spec template, that comment right there, the one that David's sharing right now. And so we submitted a new PR that added this behavior and it got merged. So we went ahead with default value.
Got it. Is there a like an example of what that looks like somewhere? Like I don't
Oh, from
I
our side?
I found 387, but I don't see like a something I can look at to understand what the interface is. Maybe there's an example somewhere in there. So it looks like it's name and default in the supply chain, but the supply chain is the only place with default. Is that right? Or is default also the thing in the template?
So template has default. A supply chain has default and value, and the workload only has value.
Interesting. Is there a reason template has? It's like defaults are always overridable and values are never overridable. Is that the idea?
Yeah, exactly.
And template has had default since it's like the original cartographer setup. It's from like issue 9 and continue from way back when.
That makes sense. I feel like it's a little undecided about if I like template having default, but I don't think I have a strong enough opinion to say either way. So it sounds good. I just wanted to understand where it went. I can update the kind of large internal doc also to cover that.
Awesome.
Great. Okay. Yeah, let me add a note here. If there's not anything else to discuss, that will be it for the week.
Actually, one quick thing from last week. I'm just looking through stuff that was talked about on RFC 14. Wishimi suggested adding information about the resource that it passed through. Is there a reason we need that versus just the name of the like? There's a separate name that identifies the component that it links to. Is there a reason to include both the resource information and the name of the component? Are you worried like what happens in the supply chain changes or something like that?
It's less when the supply chain changes. I think in that note I had pointed to an issue where essentially the reasoning from that issue I think applies equally here, and Josh can speak to that. I believe that 378. I know one motivation, and it may be the only one, is that workload authors know they may have access to the objects, but they don't always have access to the supply chain. And so when they see XY, this was about the messages, oh, we're waiting on something. And if they didn't have the supply chain there, the component name wouldn't be very useful to them to understand what's going on. Similarly, if we're saying like, here's this artifact and it comes from this component name, but they can't look at the supply chain, then they don't really know what object that comes off of.
I'm curious about, it's like the proposed association creates a kind API version name and namespace association with the artifact or with the reference to the other artifact, right? So it's like, it's not associated with the artifact itself. It's just when an artifact comes from another artifact, you say it came from that artifact through this other resource. Is that right? But then we still have this past list that describes the stages that have been through. Do we need the past list anymore if we are keeping track of the what resource the other thing, like does this conflict, or is this duplicate information with past? Do we need to reconsider that interface?
I think the problem is that past references a concept in the supply chain, right? Whereas if you're looking at the workload, you're probably also looking, you're associating it with resources within your namespace, right? And so we need to make the connection between the underlying item that would have been in that past block. So if we're talking about if the supply chain past criteria is like an image builder, right? We need to actually make a reference to the underlying resource.
Yeah, and I think this muddies like whether this information should be in from along with that ID. I think is a I'm not sure that it should. Like those are really different concepts. But there should be some term that allows you to specify like here's the original object that this was read off of.
So like you have source code and it passes through a few stages unchanged, right? Does that source code say it came from source code from itself with different references, or should all this really be in the past list? And the past list says this resource passed through, this artifact passed through these resources. I'm pretty sure it should be the latter, right? And so unless you disagree, we could flip the model so that it creates a chain of links to itself. But I think because we're trying to form an artifact, like say artifacts turn into other artifacts, right? It might make more sense to represent the artifacts, the top level, and then use past to represent the resources that they pass through. So like moving the information that you proposed from there into past instead, and then having separate resource name versus component name in there might be one way to solve it.
Yeah, I don't have any objections to that. I wonder if there should be some, and this may be tangential or orthogonal, some way to note like the resource that it wasn't just passed from, but that it originated from. And maybe if past is just an ordered list, then we're like, yeah, it's the first one in the list.
The resource that the artifact originated from, not the artifact that the artifact originated from, is what you meant, right?
Yes.
So the first one in past should be the thing that generated it. Yeah, totally agree. Just making sure we're on the same page. Cool. I can leave a comment after your comment on that to move it around. I just wanted to make sure we got the nitty-gritty right. Cool.
Can Kate's events they have an owner reference, right? The event object? It's just like any other CRD, so I'm assuming it has an owner reference. Which is like actually multiple owner references. You can have multiple, right?
It has involved objects. So like you can link one to the other. I'm not sure if it has an owner reference, like in terms of GC, you know.
Right.
Not sure. I'm not
involved objects. Yeah, which is probably more accurate in this case anyway. I'm just wondering if we should try and model these relationships as events instead of having them in status.
One thing about events is that like they might be collected at any point, and I think there's some aggregation that can happen as well behind the scenes. But I'm super into considering it. I think it makes sense. I don't know enough about it, to be honest.
Even if like maybe all the historical artifacts get captured in events, and then we have a concept of like where the I don't know, a most recent, like the current accurate representation as per the workflow spec can be kept in the status.
We don't want historical things to be kept as events because how many do you keep in etcd, right? It's the like what's the right amount to keep on the cluster in that case? I figured the historical relationships should go into some kind of more permanent storage, but it's like, could you represent the artifact tree in status, but then represent the passing of artifacts through the resources as events instead, and then have something that goes between those two things? But at that point, what's the use of having the separate event objects?
I think we should have events anyway, like as a way of providing a nice experience for folks to be able to tell, like, oh, this thing happened, that thing happened.
Agree.
Yeah, as a storage medium, yeah, I'm not super sure.
But it would in theory be representing kind of the same information that we're trying to represent in status here, right? It's like an artifact did something.
Yeah, like I think the semantics like makes sense to make the relationship between events and what we're trying to do. But I think the way they're treated and that is expected to be used in Kubernetes, I think there might be a mismatch there. But again, I'm not super familiar with events, really. I think it's worth putting a note, though.
I think it's going to be helpful to have at least the current state of the world tracked in one parsable place that we can easily return back to the user and show in a graph, right? Without having to parse through events. But I agree. I like the idea of events being made available when things happen to improve the user experience. Argo is some prior art for like keeping track of, this type of information, right? For workflows.
I think they overflow to a different storage mechanism too, right? I believe
we
they
could do
actually
that.
store. Yeah.
We could do that though, right? You can even set the registry as a backend, right? For the artifact tree, and then as artifacts drop off, they're no longer part of the tree. They stay in the registry based storage, and then you don't need any external other kinds of storage, and your CLI can parse, understand how to go from the CRD to the registry that it's writing to, and then automatically give you historical information. Then magically on VKE and any place you deploy Cartographer, you get infinite history. But I haven't sold everybody on my everybody should use the registry for everything idea. Blob storage may not be the right thing for this too.
Great. Okay, thank you. Anything else? Got RFC 14 or any other?
Yeah, so I just kind of dropped in RFC 10. We've got an implementation that's merged to main. I assume that we should go ahead and finalize that RFC with the current default value. That can be some of the documentation on how that works. And then I think that's accepted. We can mark it accepted. We can drop it into an accepted folder.
Sounds good to me.
Right.
Probably RFC 15 as well, right? Same thing.
And then RFC 16 had an action item to update it with some concrete examples, which I've done. There are some open questions there. I don't know what. Maybe I'll just. Have those been answered? Shall we poke them again next week?
Is there a link to RFC 16 issues. Oh, there it is. Okay. Are there comments here? I just see a draft with nothing on it.
I think all the comments came just in our meeting last week.
Oh, I see.
So there are a couple of open questions in the notes. What does validation mean for config, which is a large block of YAML? Do we need another template type for config known to be Kate's objects? So I have proceeded. My understanding has always been that cluster config templates are meant to hold a Kate's object. And I've written it like that currently, but I think that we had some open questions at the last meeting. Are they being used in other ways right now? And do we expect them to be used in other ways? And that I think that in some ways that's a little bit of a validation question, but it's also just a what template types do we need question.
Yeah, I threw that spanner in the works from what I'd heard in the past.
Pod template spec, they're used to like convey chunks of information about that would go into a deployment or another resource pretty often in examples we have. So I don't think a config is a Kate's resource. I think it could be many Kate's resources. It could be a snippet of the inside of a Kate's resource, but I'd say it's probably valid. Saying that it's valid YAML, it's probably good enough. And that also buys you JSON as a subset of YAML, which is nice. And so maybe just validating it with a YAML parser would be a good first step.
So we never have to worry about strings, people trying to do string information from a config.
It feels weird that I don't think if people are using config and they're just passing a string through and then interpolating it somewhere else, like maybe they're thinking that it's going to be YAML that ends up there and it's not, right? So
yeah,
maybe better to be strict.
It's just, yeah, it was just that because I was coming at that particular validation from having heard people say, well, it's just any old string, right? I think they meant it's just any old string that represents a bunch of documents, right? It can be one or more. That's what I think they meant. But because they said it could be any old string, I wanted to double check that. Yeah.
And document or subset of document, right? Yeah.
Here's a question. Isn't a string valid YAML? What's not valid YAML?
A valid YAML has to be key valued. A string won't parse in the YAML parser.
So I'm fine with this saying that it has to be key value pairs. I don't know how canonical YQ is, but if you echo hi to YQ, it'll be like, yeah, this is a string hi.
It's not canonical. It's a valid snippet of YAML.
I guess when we say we want to allow us part of a resource, right? Does that part of a resource include a string field of a value that's a string field of a key, right? And then I think the answer there is probably no. It's got to be
key value pairs.
Yeah.
Well, key object pairs. Yeah.
Array of objects too, or no?
Or comments, or
has to be a valid YAML document by itself, but it doesn't have to be a valid Kate's resource. Maybe is a way to put it.
And it can be multi-YAML docs, right?
Yeah, for sure. Multi-document. It could be multiple resources. I guess, yeah, sure. It should be able to be. What happens if you, no, I think that's right. It should be able to be multiple documents.
Because I'm pretty sure that's one of the things that the intents are doing. They're coming up with a bunch of documents you might want to apply.
Right.
Yep. Yeah.
Definitely. What about images? Should we be validating the images are really only digests? Because you shouldn't be promoting a tag, really. Should we translate tags into digests as soon as we see them?
I would not.
But I would need to have the credentials, right? If it's coming from a private.
I don't like the translating. I agree, but I think maybe some that was an idea somebody had early on. I wonder if just enforcing that they are digests though and not tags would be a good first step. So you can't accidentally promote a tag that gets overridden.
Right now it says digest. It does not have a call out for tags. I'm happy to stick one in there. Okay, and presumably with those changes, RFC 16 is ready to go.
Sounds good to me.
All right.
You might want to upgrade it from a draft before make it approval.
Mm-hmm.
Or I can't hit the approve button to signify my approval until you move it from a draft into the other thing.
Okay, sounds good.
It sounds good. Yeah, those are all the open questions from last meeting. And yeah, thank you for adding the action items there. So anything else? Nope. Okay, so thank you so much for your time. See you next week.